Mark straightened his cufflinks and told the board that pausing my career was the sacrifice our family business needed. He put my career on pause for the family business. I knew where the company's money was really going. I sat 2 seats down from him at that dinner, watching him do what he always did when a lie left his mouth easily. His fingers found the silver links at his wrist, turned them once, then let go, like he was screwing a lid on something. Nobody else at the table noticed. I had been noticing for 6 years. 6 years earlier, I ran the finance division of Whitmore Holdings, my father's company before it became ours by marriage, and then, somehow, only Mark's by default. I had built the reporting systems that let us see cash flow across 4 subsidiaries in real time. I had trained the junior analysts who now reported to a man who couldn't read a balance sheet without a translator. When our daughter was born, Mark sat across from me at our kitchen table and said the department needed a single clear voice at the top, and that voice should be his, for now, until things settled. Things never settled. I stepped back from the CFO seat. He stepped into it and never offered it back. I told myself I still had influence. I sat on 2 committees. I reviewed quarterly summaries he handed me, already condensed, already filtered through whatever story he wanted me to read. I raised my daughter. I watched Mark shake hands at galas, watched him thank me publicly for holding down the fort while he built our future, watched 300 people in tuxedos applaud a man who hadn't built anything in years. For a long stretch, I let it go. There's a particular numbness that comes from being thanked in public for a sacrifice you never agreed to. It sounds like gratitude. It functions like a lock. Every year at the shareholder dinner, Mark would raise a glass to his family. He meant me. He meant our daughter. Mostly, he meant the idea of a family more than the people in it. Every year I would raise my glass back and smile, because the alternative was making a scene in a ballroom with 400 witnesses and no evidence. The dinner where the phrase first left my mouth was a smaller affair, a fundraiser at the Belmont Club for a hospital wing bearing our family name. Mark stood at the podium and called himself a family man before he called himself a businessman, in that order, every time, because the order was the point. I sat with my hands folded over the silver ring on my right hand, the one engraved with a single letter E. It was my grandmother's ring, the one I turned when I needed my hands to do something instead of shake. I turned it once and thought the sentence through in full for the first time. I didn't say it out loud that night. I said it to myself once, clean and flat, and I meant it as a fact rather than a complaint. Beside me, an older board member leaned in and said Mark had built something remarkable, hadn't he? I said he certainly had a gift for the podium. She laughed like I'd made a joke. I hadn't. There were 3 moments from that stretch of years I kept returning to, small enough that no outsider would have called them anything at all. The first was the afternoon I asked to sit in on the quarterly investor call, the same call I used to run myself. Mark told me the room was already full. Through the glass wall, I could see 4 empty chairs. The second was a dinner with his college friends, where he introduced me as the woman who kept the family running. I watched a man I'd never met nod at me the way you nod at a nice appliance. The third was smaller still. Our daughter's school asked for a parent to speak at Career Day. Mark volunteered without asking me first, then stood in front of a room of 8-year-olds describing decisions that had been mine 2 years earlier, dressed up now as his own. I sat in the back row that afternoon, in a folding chair meant for a parent, listening to him describe my own instincts as his. I remember thinking that if I ever wrote any of this down, that would be the first sentence. Each of those moments arrived wrapped in some public performance of care. He'd bring home flowers the same week he canceled a meeting I'd asked to attend. He'd post a photo of our family on his company profile. The caption was always something about balance and partnership. I noticed later that the timing lined up. Each post landed within days of a transfer to Devlin Maritime Consulting. I didn't connect the dates on purpose at first. I connected them because once you start keeping a private ledger of a person's behavior, you can't stop your mind from running the columns. 2 nights later, I found the fact behind the sentence I'd been carrying for months. I want to walk back a little, because the picture I'm describing didn't come from paranoia. It came from arithmetic. For 18 months, I had noticed small oddities in the summaries Mark handed me. a consulting fee to a firm with no online presence, a licensing payment to a subsidiary in Malta that didn't appear on our org chart, a line item labeled strategic reserves that moved by hundreds of thousands of dollars with no memo attached. I raised 2 of these at a committee meeting once. Mark called it an accounting quirk left over from the merger and moved to the next slide before anyone could ask a follow-up question. I remembered the ease of it. I remembered how quickly the room let him move on. I didn't confront him. I watched. The trigger came on a Tuesday, in our kitchen, at 11 at night. Mark had gone up to bed early, claiming a headache. He'd left his phone face down on the counter next to the coffee machine, its screen cracked in the lower right corner from a fall 6 months back he'd never bothered to fix. It buzzed once. I wasn't hunting for it. I was rinsing a glass. But the buzz lit the screen through the crack, and I saw a banking notification stacked on top of 3 others, a transfer confirmation from an account I didn't recognize, routed through a name I did. Devlin Maritime Consulting. The same name that had shown up 18 months earlier as a consulting fee with no online presence. $240,000 moved that afternoon while Mark was supposedly in back-to-back investor calls. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. I had already memorized the routing pattern from the quarterly reports. Now I had a name attached to a live transaction, time-stamped, moving in real time. For hours earlier, my husband had stood at a podium promising transparency to a room full of shareholders. I wrote the name on a sticky note, folded it into my pocket, and went to bed beside a man who slept like nothing in the world could touch him. The next morning, I opened a spreadsheet I hadn't touched in a year and started again from the beginning. For the next several months, I worked the way I used to work before I had a husband running the company, methodically, quietly, before anyone else in the house was awake. I pulled every filing Whitmore Holdings had made with regulators over the past 3 years and cross-referenced them against the internal reports Mark had circulated to the board. I built a second spreadsheet, one he never saw, tracking every discrepancy between the two. Devlin Maritime Consulting appeared 4 times. A shell entity called Northgate Asset Partners appeared 6 times, always in amounts under the threshold that would trigger an automatic audit flag. A Maltese subsidiary, registered under a name close enough to one of our real subsidiaries that a tired auditor would skim right past it, appeared 11 times. I hired an outside forensic accountant through a friend from business school, paid him in cash from an account Mark didn't know I still had, and told him only what he needed to know. His name was David. He had a thin scar through his left eyebrow from a bike accident in college, a detail he mentioned once and that I never forgot. It was the only unguarded thing about him in our first 3 meetings. Everything else he did was careful. He worked from copies, never originals. He flagged transactions I'd missed. He built a timeline that ran parallel to mine and matched it almost exactly. We met on Thursday mornings in a coffee shop 2 towns over, far enough that no one from Whitmore would recognize either of us. David would spread printouts across the small table between us, tapping each anomaly with a pen instead of his finger. He kept a physical distance from the paper, as if it might one day be evidence he'd need to swear he never touched. He asked me once why I hadn't gone straight to the board with what I already had. I told him a half-built case gets buried, and a buried case gets you divorced with nothing to show for it. He nodded and kept working. David's process was slower than I wanted, and I said so more than once. He answered the same way every time. A case built in a week collapses in a day. A case built in months holds up in court. He walked me through each entity before he'd let me combine them into one narrative. Devlin Maritime Consulting was registered to a shell address above a laundromat. Its listed officer's signature didn't match any signature Mark had ever used on a Whitmore document. Northgate Asset Partners existed only on paper, its filings built by the same small circle of formation agents David had traced in an unrelated case years earlier. The Maltese subsidiary was the cleverest of the 3, its name close enough to a real Whitmore entity that even I had skimmed past it twice before David caught the single swapped letter. He printed a master timeline eventually. He taped separate sheets of paper end to end across his kitchen wall, in the apartment where we sometimes worked instead of the coffee shop. The first time I saw the whole thing laid out, 3 years of transfers strung together in red ink. I had to sit down. It wasn't a suspicion anymore by then. It was a shape, and the shape had a name on it, and the name was my husband's. At the office, my old assistant Sarah had stayed on, moved sideways into a compliance role after I stepped back, and she still kept the same mint-covered notepad she'd carried since her first week at Whitmore. She was the one who first flagged a discrepancy in a reconciliation report months before I started actively looking, back when it was still just a line item that didn't sit right with her. She brought it to me quietly over coffee, not to Mark, because she said something about the way he'd waved off her last 2 questions made her not want to ask a third. I told her to keep the notepad updated and keep it to herself. She did for 11 months, without complaint, filling page after page with dates and reference numbers in handwriting so small I sometimes needed a loop to read it back. I retained a lawyer named Mr. Lowe, recommended by David, a corporate litigator known for cases exactly like the one I was building without yet calling it a case. He wore glasses in a narrow diamond frame and had a habit of pulling them off sharply whenever a client tried to soften a fact he didn't want softened. The first time I laid the spreadsheet in front of him, I hedged one number, rounding down instead of up out of some old instinct to protect Mark even then. Lowe took his glasses off, set them on the table, and asked me to give him the real number. I gave it to him. He put the glasses back on and didn't ask again. Lowe explained, in that first meeting, exactly what I was allowed to do as a sitting committee chair and exactly what I wasn't. I could authorize an independent audit without Mark's signature. I couldn't remove him from his position without board action. I couldn't go to regulators alone without exposing myself to a defamation claim if the numbers didn't hold up under scrutiny. Every boundary he drew, I wrote down. I had spent years inside spreadsheets that told a story someone else wanted told. I wasn't going to let this one collapse on a technicality. We met 4 more times that month, always in his office, always with the door closed. Lowe wanted proof beyond bank notifications and cross-referenced filings. He wanted something that would hold against defense attorneys paid to find one loose thread. He asked if any employee had first-hand knowledge of the transfers. I gave him Sarah's name. He asked if anyone had documented the timeline independently. I gave him David's name. Piece by piece, the case stopped being mine alone. It became something 3 people had built without ever sitting in the same room, which was, Lowe said, exactly what made it hard to dismiss. Mark noticed none of it. If anything, he grew more expansive that spring, more visible, more certain of his own narrative. He gave an interview to a regional business magazine describing Whitmore Holdings as a family legacy he was honored to protect. He told our daughter, in front of me, that Mommy's job was to make sure the house ran well while Daddy made sure the company did. I turned my ring under the table and said nothing. There were nights he came home late, smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't the one he wore in the mornings, explaining a meeting that ran long. I stopped listening to the content of his explanations and started only watching his hands. His hands told me more than his mouth ever did. By early spring I had signed contracts with an outside audit firm, coordinated through David and Lowe. It was structured so Mark's signature wasn't required to authorize a review. As chair of 2 board committees, I still held authority he'd forgotten I had. The audit firm's engagement letter sat in my desk drawer for 6 weeks before I found the right moment to activate it. The same drawer held the encrypted flash drive David had given me. It carried a complete archive of every offshore transaction we'd traced, backed up in triplicate, with 1 copy in a safe deposit box under my maiden name. The audit itself took 11 weeks. I remember the number because I counted every one of them, marking them off in the back of a notebook I kept separate from the spreadsheet, separate from anything Mark could stumble across. The auditors worked from a satellite office 2 floors below Mark's, under a cover story about a routine compliance refresh tied to an upcoming refinancing round. The story was plausible enough that nobody questioned it. Not even Mark, who signed off on the refinancing paperwork himself without reading past the summary page. He never read past the summary page. That had always been his blind spot, and it became, in the end, the exact blind spot that let me finish the work in peace. I kept working through it the way I'd once closed quarterly books, line by line, no shortcuts, no assumptions I couldn't support with the document. Some nights I'd sit at the kitchen table long after Mark went up. It was the same table where he'd once told me my career needed to pause. I ran numbers under a single lamp, my ring turning slow circles under my thumb. It didn't feel like anger by then. It felt like arithmetic finishing itself. Twice during those 11 weeks, I nearly lost my nerve. Once, when Mark came home unannounced in the middle of a Thursday afternoon and found me at the kitchen table with a folder open, and I had to tell him it was old tax paperwork before he'd even asked. He believed me without hesitation, which told me something about how little he thought I still paid attention to numbers at all. The second time was smaller. David called to say the Maltese subsidiary had quietly changed its registered address. It was a detail that meant nothing to the case, but everything to my nerves, because it meant somebody, somewhere, might be getting careful. I didn't sleep that night. I finished the reconciliation anyway, by lamplight, ring turning, until the number balanced. The auditor's preliminary report landed in my inbox on a Sunday, 40 pages of appendices behind an 11-page summary. I read every page twice before I let myself believe it matched what David and I had already built independently. It did, almost exactly, down to the dollar in most quarters. The one place it diverged, the auditors had actually found a fourth entity we'd missed, a smaller shell called Corrigan Freight Solutions that had received 2 payments disguised as logistics costs on a subsidiary's books. I called David immediately. He was quiet on the line for a moment, then said that was the mark of a real audit rather than a confirmation exercise, when the outside team finds something you didn't already know to look for. I brought the fourth entity to Lowe the next morning, and he added it to the disclosure draft without comment, the way you'd add a line to a grocery list. By then the case had grown large enough that individual discoveries no longer shook me the way the first one had. Somewhere in that 11th week, I remember thinking I had become a different kind of person. I could read the words $4 million in stolen company funds routed to my husband. I felt only the small, satisfying click of a puzzle piece locking into place. The board meeting where it broke open was scheduled as a routine quarterly review, the kind Mark had chaired without incident for years. I asked Lowe to be present as outside counsel reviewing a compliance matter, a request the board approved without much scrutiny, since I still sat as committee chair and had every right to bring in counsel. Sarah sat near the back with her notepad, close enough to the projector cable that no one thought twice about her being there. David waited in the hallway with a laptop bag until I texted him one word. Mark opened the meeting the way he opened every meeting, thanking everyone for their commitment to what he called our shared family vision. He had no idea yet what was coming. I asked for the floor on a compliance item. The board chair, a longtime friend of my father's, granted it without hesitation. I said that an independent audit, authorized under committee bylaws, had identified a pattern of undisclosed transfers to entities not listed on our corporate structure. I said the total exceeded $4 million over 3 years. I said the pattern traced back to accounts controlled by the CEO. Mark's hand went to his cufflinks again, but this time it didn't finish the motion. It stopped halfway, hovering, and stayed there. David came in with the laptop and connected it to the main screen without being asked twice. He pulled up the transaction ledger we'd built together, Devlin Maritime, Northgate Asset Partners, the Maltese subsidiary with the name close enough to fool a tired auditor. Numbers scrolled across the boardroom screen in a font too clean and too calm for what they represented. He said the offshore accounts had been active as recently as 3 weeks prior, and that the routing patterns matched exactly across all 11 instances his team had traced. Mr. Lowe set a folder of supporting contracts on the table in front of the board chair. He took his glasses off and set them down beside it, a small, deliberate gesture. It told everyone in the room this was no longer a discussion. It was a filing. He said Whitmore Holdings was obligated, under both its own bylaws and applicable securities law, to report the findings to regulators within 5 business days, and that he had already drafted the disclosure. Someone near the end of the table said, quietly, that this couldn't be right. Sarah, without raising her voice, said she'd flagged the first discrepancy 11 months ago and had the dated notes to prove it. She set the mint-covered notepad on the table, opened to a page dense with small handwriting, and slid it toward the board chair. Mark looked at me across the table, and for the first time in years, I watched him try to find a version of the truth he could still manage. He said something about strategic reserves, about consulting arrangements that had simply been mislabeled, about a misunderstanding he could clear up if given time. His voice didn't shake. His hands did. I didn't raise my voice either. I looked back at him and said it the way I'd have said any other fact in that room. He'd put my career on pause for the family business. I'd spent years being thanked for the sacrifice while he moved the company's money somewhere I wasn't supposed to look. I let it sit there unhurried because a fact doesn't need volume to land. Nobody in that room said anything for a moment. Then the board chair asked Mark to step outside while the committee reviewed next steps. Mark stood and adjusted his jacket instead of his cufflinks this time because there was nothing left to hide behind. He walked out into the hallway alone. He tried, over the following weeks, to recover ground. He hired his own counsel. He called board members individually, appealing to decades of friendship, to loyalty, to the Whitmore name. 2 of them still took his calls out of old habit, though neither budged once they'd seen the ledger for themselves. He called me twice a day for a week, alternating between apology and blame. Once he told me I had destroyed the family to win an argument. Another time he said he'd only ever done it to give our daughter a better life. Neither version moved me, because I had stopped needing his version of events the night I saw a bank notification light up a cracked phone screen in our kitchen. One afternoon, he showed up at the house uninvited, while our daughter was at school. He stood in the driveway asking why I hadn't warned him privately before bringing it to the board. As if a private warning would have done anything but give him time to move the last of the money somewhere colder. I told him I had warned him, for 6 years, every time I asked to see a report he hadn't already filtered. Every time I raised a discrepancy, he waved off with a joke about mergers. He said that wasn't a warning, that was an accusation. I told him he'd never once been able to tell the difference, and that was, in the end, the whole problem. The investigation regulators ran through the summer and into the following spring. 2 of the shell entities were traced back to accounts Mark had opened using a version of his signature David had flagged as inconsistent from the start. Devlin Maritime Consulting turned out to have paid, over 3 years, for a boat and a second apartment 2 states away. It had also paid for a series of transfers to a woman named in exactly none of the paperwork, confirmed eventually by a hotel record David's contact turned up almost as an afterthought. I read that detail once, in a summary Lowe forwarded me, and felt nothing sharper than a dull confirmation of something I'd already priced into the story months earlier. The board removed him as CEO within the month. The disclosure went to regulators on schedule, filed under Lowe's name with my signature beside it as committee chair. An investigation opened that would run for the better part of a year, and Mark spent much of it fielding calls from lawyers rather than shareholders. I was appointed interim CEO 2 weeks after the board meeting, a decision the same longtime friend of my father's proposed before I could even raise my hand. Word moved through the company faster than any press release could. By the second morning, people I'd never worked with directly were stopping by my office door just to introduce themselves properly, as if the last 6 years hadn't happened, as if I were new rather than returning. I didn't correct anyone. I let them think what they needed to think. I had spent enough years being underestimated that I wasn't going to spend my first week back explaining the arithmetic of it. The first week in that office felt strange in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't triumphant. It was mostly logistical, reassigning Mark's direct reports, briefing shareholders on a timeline Lowe had helped me script down to the sentence, walking Sarah through a promotion she'd earned 11 months earlier and never once asked for. I moved my old chair back behind the desk where it had sat before our daughter was born. Sitting down in it again, I noticed it still fit exactly the way it used to, as if it had been waiting the whole time for me to remember it was mine. David stayed on as a consultant through the regulatory investigation, since the government's own auditors wanted someone who already knew the shape of the fraud rather than starting cold. We kept meeting on Thursday mornings for a while, out of habit more than necessity, though the printouts on the table eventually turned into ordinary quarterly reports instead of evidence. Sarah kept the mint-covered notepad on her new desk, though she told me once she'd started a second one, just for the good news, because 11 months of bad news had worn the first one thin. The last time I saw Mark in that building, he came by to collect a box of personal items from his old office. Security walked him up and stood by the elevator the entire time, a formality the board had insisted on. I could tell it cost Mark something, being watched carrying his own coffee mug and framed photos out in a box, like a stranger. He didn't try to explain anything else. He didn't reach for his cufflinks, because he'd stopped wearing them by then, as if some part of him understood they'd become evidence of a tell rather than an accessory. He asked, quietly, if there was anything left to salvage between us. I told him the company had already answered that question for both of us. He nodded once, picked up the box, and didn't look back toward my office on his way out, which was, in its own small way, the first honest thing he'd done in front of me in years. I sat down that evening at the same kitchen table where he'd once told me my career needed to pause. I slid the silver ring off my right hand, set it flat on the wood, and looked at it for a long moment, the letter E catching the last bit of evening light. I didn't put it back on. I left it there and went to check on our daughter, who was asleep, unaware that the version of our family she'd grow up remembering had just changed shape entirely. If someone poured your career into a pause button while they quietly built a different life on the side, would you have noticed the cufflinks before I did? Tell me in the comments, and if this story hit home, hit like and subscribe for the next one.